Hi, this is Beenish Ahmed, founder of The Alignist. Just gearing up for our conversation about India. Give me just a moment and I'll bring in Karan and Bilal. As soon as I figure out how to do that. Let's see. All right, so this is Beenish Ahmed. Hi. Hi, all.
Hello.
Hi. So this is Beenish Ahmed. I'm the founder of The Alignist, and I'm here joined by Karan Mahajan and Bilal Baloch, ready to talk about our second ever box featuring India. Just to kind of introduce, I'm sure most of the people joining, most of our subscribers know Karan Mahajan through his work, The Association of Small Bombs, which was the featured novel in the March-April edition. And as you may not know, that book was a finalist for the 2016 National Book Award. And his first novel was called Family Planning, which dealt with a government minister and the father of 13 as they moved through their lives from Delhi. And he joins us now from Delhi. We're also joined by Bilal Baloch, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Advanced Indian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His work focuses on political economy of government behavior in India, and he's written about how corruption shapes policy in India, and that's something we caught just a bit of a glimpse of in the Association of Small Bombs, and he joins us from Philadelphia. So I've got some questions for both of you, and then we'll open it up if any questions come through. Subscribers, listeners, watchers can type them into the chat box alongside, and we'll try to monitor for those. Let me just, okay, so we've got just a couple viewers now, but yes, you can feel free to dive in with questions as we go forward in this. So just to start, Karan, the book is loosely based on a bombing that occurred when you were growing up in India. Can you tell us a little bit about that and kind of how it stayed with you, you know, as you grew, and what your, you know, how your memories of it kind of persisted to influence you?
Well, so I'm actually back in Delhi right now, in my parents' house, the house that I grew up in, and this house is about 15 minutes away from Lajpat Nagar Market, which is where this bombing happened in 1996. And it was a market that I went to very often with my parents usually. I would go there to buy my school uniform, so it had a particular kind of significance for me. And I remember that the day the bombing occurred, there was a lot of discussion about it in our house because my grandmother had been there just the day before to buy some yarn from the market. And so it stayed with me in this very anecdotal way. I don't actually recall seeing any real news on TV or even reading much about it because I was 12 years old. But it stayed with me, and as an event in which I could have lost a family member, And then I really didn't think about it again until years later. The Mumbai attacks happened in 2008. And strangely, my reaction to that event, which was such a huge one in which about 160 people were killed, more than 400 were injured. My reaction to that was to start remembering this smaller bomb and wondering what the consequences of an attack that wasn't really covered or televised would have been. And also, if you were someone who had survived from that period in 96, when terrorism was still a major subject, but not internationalized in the way it is today, how you might be seeing the tragedy yourself in 2001, in 2005, in 2008. So it really was about the process of taking this one memory and looking at it from as many different temporal and sort of physical angles as possible.
Yeah, and I just because you bring it up, I'll ask a follow up. Was the structure of the book immediately obvious to you, or did it kind of evolve where you felt a desire to bring in these different perspectives? And I guess like what was kind of the importance to you to kind of share all of those different aspects of kind of the fragmented experiences of this one singular event?
No, it took ages for the structure to develop. It took years, about 5 years, I would say. And part of that, I think, is with novels, you have to actually make yourself a little bit stupid in order to write them. You have to forget how you came up with the concept, because my initial impulse was to have characters immediately discuss how it was a small bombing when the bombing happens in 1996, because that's in some ways the idea I had begun with. And it took me a long time to realize, of course, when it occurs, it's just very confusing. You don't have the method, you don't have the means to talk about it. You're not placing it in a global context. It's just a tragedy you've been part of, right? So down to the confusion in the market where people weren't even thinking a bomb had gone off, to the fact that people aren't sure who the terrorists are, why they're doing it, to the fact that 9/11 and the 2008 bombings attacks have not even happened. So it required me to really step into the mindset of someone back in 1996. And I think the minute I was able to do that, the other structural elements just began to present themselves. I always think that the thing that's holding me back from writing is some kind of dishonesty with myself. And I think that the minute I'm able to figure out what that is, everything else becomes obvious very quickly. So it was 4 or 5 years of being dishonest with myself in some ways.
What do you mean, dishonest?
Well, I think that I mean that I wasn't actually accessing the emotions that someone back in 96, including that I might have felt, that I was bringing all these layers of analysis and knowledge to it. And I had to sort of through to a deeper subconscious right from there. And that just took a long time.
Can I just jump in with a quick question here? I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and first of all, thank you, Binish, for bringing us together. I think this is a wonderful project, and I'm particularly excited about having Karan here talking to us. Karan, I mean, just talking about, I really like that framing of you almost have to be dishonest with yourself, and almost like a historian placing yourself back in a period which you're familiar with but not, and then contextualizing that from a vantage point that is over a decade later. One of the things that I thought was just incredibly rich, and it gets to a point about method in your book, which is, you combine really these profound moments with sort of the more mundane moments, right, of people's lives, these incredibly tough and terrible events. You personalize suffering, both from a parent's perspective, but also that of the individual, in this case, the militant, going through these very complicated emotions. And oftentimes, even the reader can relate, right, in terms of the relationships, the friendships, loss. What was your method of gathering this research? Who were you speaking to? I mean, I've conducted research myself in India and in Delhi, more in the sort of academic space, but it really is a tough ask to go around and speaking in a context where, crossing these multi-ethnic and multiracial boundaries can be quite tough, let alone telling that story in the very textured way that you've told it. So it'd be great to hear more about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know you researched corruption, so you also know that it's very difficult, particularly to get people to speak about something negative in a country like India. And this is probably true in many places, but I think in some ways it's a cultural property of South Asians that they want to kind of put aside the negative and not delve into it. That was the first response I had when I went back to the market. So the year, was researching it in 2010, 2011. And it had been a number of years since the bombing. The market had sort of come back and covered over those scars the way I write about it in the book. But the shopkeepers said to me, "Why are you digging this up again? We don't want to think about it anymore. This is such a horrible thing that happened to us." And there were several who refused. There was a few who spoke to me. And I think their attitudes were extremely helpful. So like, there was a few of the shopkeepers who said, "Look, we're not mad at the terrorists anymore. We're not even sure the government arrested the terrorists because we don't trust the government. And the reason we don't trust the government is that apart from the fact that they're extremely corrupt, they didn't pay us the compensation they promised. They kept coming and actually saying to us, you're inflating your estimates," and disbelieving them right in the moment of their trauma. So what I found as a fiction writer is that one of these conversations is equal to about 20 books you might read on a subject. And it never fails to fascinate me because I write books, so I would hope that books communicate the same amount as a human being, but there's something about getting their attitude which can't be portrayed in any other way. Sorry, there was some kind of echo there for a second. You hear that?
I just wondered. Yeah, so that's so those you kind of like went through and put and reinserted some of that in the book, but also I think what's striking is the deeply personal stories come through the kind of long, beyond what maybe people would have the perspective of. But I just want to turn the conversation also to Bilal to ask about, the frequency of these kinds of small bombings and how they're dealt with. Karan mentioned the kind of corruption that we see flare up in their wake. And it's, it's interesting to me that that they're so diminished, while in the Western world we see these kinds of attacks have the opposite response. So often they are played up, and they're tragedies. Of course, I'm not saying that they're not, but to have that there's kind of that there's sort of an imbalance of importance given to these kinds of attacks. And I just wonder about the kind of frequency of them, and if you could speak to how you see them play out in the lives of people from kind of a policy perspective, and how these things are, just how there's maybe a little bit of a disjointed approach to them.
Yeah, I think things have changed quite significantly, and I think that's where the periodization of Karan's book is fascinating, right? The 90s are not just a consequential period with regards to political violence and the globalization of what is often called sort of either political Islam or in its radicalized form, not just in the subcontinent, but across the Middle East, right? And that shift from the 90s into the 2000s also coincides with a shift in political violence and Islamist violence, shift from its locus in the Middle East to more localized forms. So we end up seeing more of these terrorist attacks or violent communal attacks in local settings, not just pertaining to the Arab-Israeli context, for example. And so the frequency is an interesting question, because the small bombs, the everyday violence, the riots, that was very much part of the South Asian urban diet for a very long time, in the 90s particularly. And Karan mentioned some of these moments. But I think actually today, if a car bomb was to go off, or there were to be a bomb or an attack in a mall, say in some of India's main urban cities, like a Bombay, a Hyderabad, a Delhi, I think it would have the kind of echoes we associate when these same attacks happen in Western capitals. I think that's both a testimony to how infrequent these attacks are now, but also it speaks to how linked the narrative around them is. And so immediately the linking up of very localized terrorist acts or militant acts in the subcontinent are immediately linked to a more international global story of jihad. And so I think that shift, the remnants of it in the 90s were far more different. We would have spoken about them in the context of political violence or political party led or political party oriented riots or what have you. And today there's a shifting of the narrative, but also the very act of violence on a global level.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's almost you know, and as militant Islam has become more of a global phenomenon, there's a bit of a globalization of the response and how these things become more interlinked than perhaps they were seen as, even though, for instance, you know, they still might be carried out by regional actors for regional purposes. For instance, the liberation of Kashmir, that sort of an idea, which is more, you know, it's localized and yet it is kind of tied into this broader narrative of political Islam more broadly. It sounds like that's what you're saying, but I wonder about the accountability factor, which still, how similar is that, the call for accountability and then the actual accountability? Is that similar across these sort of lines of, you know, if we take, for example, India and the US?
No, I don't think so, because, you know, you have to, you can't take the local politics out of it, right? And let's take India today, for example, right? We have a majority government led by the BJP that is very much born out of and subscribes to the religious nationalist vector, right? So, you know, if we were to bifurcate this, there are really two dominant concepts of the nation in India. One being the more secular nationalist founding ideology enshrined within the Constitution of India, which was really led by the Congress Party, which had both its political, legislative, and ideological fragmentation in years after independence. And the religious nationalist vector, most dominated by the Hindutva, which is the Hindu nationalist corpus led by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the RSS, the ideological wing of the BJP. Now, what all of these concepts and words mean in reality is that today there are two dominant national parties. The secular, the one that is traditionally secular nationalist, really is fragmented and bruised to a very large extent, resulting in a non-existent opposition in real terms. And the incumbent BJP, which is the vanguard of the religious right, religious political right in India, is most dominant both at the national level and across states. Now, what does that mean in terms of the question you asked about accountability? Well, it's linked to how not just terrorism, but what we're talking about here is the involvement of Muslims in these terrorist attacks and their association with radicalization. And a nationalist vector, by its definition, draws moral boundaries between the in-group and the out-group, right? That's the standard social scientists line. And we see it play out empirically, right? So Muslims today, under the BJP government, are referenced in terms of being anti-national. They are accused of spreading Islam through forced conversion. They are lynched and beaten often for rumors of eating beef or selling beef, which is a sacred meat belonging to a sacred animal within the Hindu faith. And so the question is, what is the accountability for all these heinous acts? The first point is they exist throughout South Asia. This is not just merely an Indian phenomenon. We've seen the sectarian guise of this same kind of otherizing in Pakistan, for example, and increasingly across the Middle East between the Shia-Sunni vector. But insofar as it pertains to India, the accountability here is really instructive, right? We often find BJP politicians being silent with regards to a lot of these atrocities, particularly the Prime Minister, whose language, if it hasn't been insightful, has been quite muted. And What that silence does is it emboldens extremist right-wing groups even further on both sides, right? It emboldens extremist right-wing groups that want to punish Muslims because they feel as though they can get away with it. And it emboldens right-wing extremist groups who are coming from the Islamist vector because they say, well, look, we have never been part of this country. This confirms it. And we need to double down on a more ethnically driven, a more Islamic identity driven politics. And so when you talk about accountability, I think it's important to talk specifically about the very phenomena that Karan's book really explores, which is what is happening amongst the Muslim community of India, and what does Indian Islam look like today? And at least under the current government, it's a very fraught relationship.
Yeah, I want to actually ask another question about that, which is that, we, of course, see Modi, who now subscribers have a little bit of a background insight into his, rise to power, the kind of allegations against him related to the massacre in Gujarat. But I'm really interested in how that specific moment in time, the Gujarat massacres, inform the Indian Muslim experience. In this book, we see there are characters who are very much kind of rooted in that and very conscious of that as a shock and a kind of an affront to them and their rights in this state. And others who are like, who's Modi, and don't really know who he is. And I'm sure that plays out across the country. But just generally speaking, what is the role of the Gujarat riots and and the subsequent rise of Modi? How does that tie into the Indian sense of belonging in the state? I think it's probably.
You mean the Muslim sense of belonging in the Indian state?
Yeah, because the in and out group phenomenon, how is that informed by Gujarat specifically? Because I think many subscribers would be surprised to know that there were war crimes allegations against Modi. He wasn't even allowed in the U.S. until he got diplomatic impunity. And this is a kind of a really stark situation. And so how does that impact maybe the sense of Indianness for Muslims? You spoke about this a little bit, but how is there kind of a disconnect there, and how has it been gotten worse in recent years?
Yeah, and I again, to reference Karan's book, I think the reference to Gujarat riots as sort of emboldening young Muslims and their sort of frustrations and anger, not just in India, but in communities linked to India or regionally around it, I think is pretty spot on. I think it's a tricky one, right? I think it's important to add the complexity to it, which is not all Muslims respond in the same way in India, right? So and at the same time. So following Gujarat in 2002, 2004 onwards, you also have 10 years of rule by the Congress government that brings to power cabinet ministers that are Muslims, that brings to power a president that nominally at least is Muslim. You also have a thriving film industry where again, nominally names of Muslim actors and in the arts and in literature, Muslims are also thriving and doing well in India. But I think the real repercussions for Gujarat are for everyday Muslims, especially those are sort of middle class, lower middle class, and part of the working class or the poor, in terms of displacement, in terms of not having the courts provide justice quickly enough, in terms of further marginalization, both in Gujarat and elsewhere. And I think the narrative around the Gujarat riots of essentially providing, at the time, Chief Minister Modi and now Prime Minister Modi with what's often referenced as a clean chit on his involvement, I think smacks at what is a very fundamental component of membership of a political society in India, which is your dignity. right? And I think that's been, there aren't many ways in terms of asserting that or combating that when you don't have the resources to do it. So if you are, you know, well off, and this is why Karan's book set in Delhi is interesting, right? Because Delhi is really ground zero for the inequalities and the very class-based nature of most of Indian society. So if you're a wealthy Muslim or have political capital or are, you know, famous or belong to a dynasty, you can marginalize the Gujarat riots and condemn them, but you can also enforce your political rights and rights as an Indian citizen in far more fruitful, progressive ways. But for the bulk of the Muslim community in India, I don't think they've had that avenue. And so the Gujarat riots is both what Karan speaks to with regards to emboldening a radicalization, but I also think since then it has enforced a sense of non-belonging for Muslims in India because the institutions failed them.
And I think that's interesting. That plays out very much the characters, the Delhi-based characters, and then the character who eventually becomes a perpetrator of terrorism himself. And I'm interested in that part of it. Why? Because that seems like, at least for me as a reader, a dramatic shift when we got into the headspace of blanking on his name, the character who becomes a terrorist.
Ayub, yeah.
Yeah.
Ayub.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, what was it like for you to occupy that headspace, to kind of, and why was it important for you to show the perpetrator's perspective, you know, and bring the novel sort of full circle in a way?
Well, first I wanted to say I agree with almost everything Bilal said. And also that for me, one reason I have Ayub be an activist who turns to violence is that it was very important to show that this is not a recourse that 99.9% of Muslims are taking. So I picked a character who was already deeply politicized, whose work was linked already to working with people who had been jailed for terrorism against their wills, who was kind of an egomaniac in terms of wanting to have like a Gandhi-style revolution in India, which of course was not going to work. And so for him then, if he wants to really be an actor on the political stage, and he's so marginalized in some ways, he in one swoop sort of loses his foothold in Delhi, his girlfriend, his job as an activist, and he goes back to Azamgarh, which is really the back of beyond in some ways in Uttar Pradesh. That sort of made sense as a potential way for him to assert himself. And one thing I was playing on there, which was difficult to dramatize, which I'd like to dramatize in another book, is that, so in 2001, you had the Gujarat riots, right? And then 2002, you had the Gujarat riots. And then soon after that, the BJP was in power. And what they did was they used 9/11 as an excuse to ban certain Muslim activist groups. One of them was called SIMI, which is a student Muslim group, and they just accused them of being terrorists. And that actually led to their radicalization in some ways. Many of them were forced to go underground. So, so there was all sorts of other local things going on at the time. And for me, I guess for me, the reason to get into the heads of the perpetrators was simply that it was so little understood by anyone. I certainly didn't understand it completely when I started writing the book, and that's one reason I chose to do it. And I was really interested in two or three things. One was I wanted to show that people who commit these acts are not doing them because of some injunction from God, which is how the West often reads them. They're sort of, in some sense, rational political actors, usually weaker actors who are choosing a method against an institution or a force they feel will not pay attention to them. And that, two, this so-called, I don't like the word radicalization is a word that's hardly used in the novel, just like jihad is actually never used. Because I think those words have lost their meaning over time. I think when a Western person thinks of the word radicalization, they see it as a kind of mystical brainwashing phenomenon, right? Where overnight a Muslim man, walks through a door and is suddenly a radical. No, it's a slow process of alienation and of a series of choices people make. And for me, the thing that I'm happiest with in the novel, and that was the hardest to do, was to write the religious awakening of a character in a way that was really positive for the character and really solved all sorts of problems. Because I do think that, yes, of course, a certain kind of like masculinized fundamentalist religion in any religion, Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, I don't love. It's not a great thing. But I do think that people are turning to religion because so-called Western liberalism is not giving them some of the answers that they want, or globalization is making them confused and fragmented, and they're reaching for these pre-existing edifices that come with systems and rules that are familiar to you because you grew up soaked in that context, and also because you might feel that these are actually systems and rules that were developed for someone like me, which is something Mansoor thinks at one point when he starts really getting into the customs of Islam and the life of Muhammad and reading Al-Tabari and all this stuff, where he feels, oh, this I connect with this more personally than I connected with Ayn Rand, which is his sort of first conversion to Western principles. So there was all these different things, but yeah, it took a long time to get to that point, and it's a very tricky subject. So I always felt nervous when I was writing the book, but that also drove me on because I felt that someone needed to do it.
Yeah, and I think that's.
I do want to say, sorry, Binish, between your words, that I think the novel form, and this is both testimony to Karan's book, but although others that have preceded it that have sought to disaggregate and bring out the complexity of, pathways to, let's just use the word of sort of radical behavior. Let's perhaps not radicalization as such, but especially in the South Asian context, I think the novel form has perhaps told us more and informed us better than a lot of our social scientific frameworks, because to Karan's point, they have tended to be either binaries or they have sought to build a taxonomy of behavior. So, what does the terrorist mind look like? What does the terrorist, qua terrorist in terms of their societal background look like? And quite frankly, the truth is every time there is a new attack, we have a new set of data with regards to, okay, everything that we've heard so far about the typical background or taxonomy is no longer true. But having said that, I think there are certain threads and backgrounds that do exist amongst a lot of terrorist and militants that currently brings out regards to disillusionment, actually being anchored in a very non-Islamic way of life, and turning to Islam as opposed to coming from its tradition. And this very much fits in with what a lot of the leading scholars in this area have spoken about, which is not radicalization of Islam, but the Islamization of radicalism. And that's not just a play on words, it forces us to think more about why and how rebellious youth have found in Islam the paradigm of a total revolt. So folks are on their journey as opposed to textual analysis alone. And I think Karan's book really brings that up.
Yeah, I find that so interesting, and I think that that nuance, that reassertion of that nuance, needs to happen, as much as possible. It's fascinating to me when we do get these glimpses into individual terrorists, and I have, think very frequently of video surveillance from the Taj Hotel attack, where the perpetrators were so kind of beguiled by the opulence of that hotel that the guy who was instructing them kept reminding them that they were there to destroy it all. And they were just like, no, but you have no idea how big these TV screens are. And I think it's so interesting that, and in this book too, there's kind of the idea of, one who has been radicalized and radicalized his sense of Islam trying to get others on board with that, because there is that aspect of it too, which often we talk about the radicalization process and the recruitment of ISIS, for example, but that there's far more at play, and a lot of the kind of general marginalization that plays into it, which I think Bilal mentioned before. So I think that the levels of nuance and the levels of radicalization were very, really interesting. And in some ways, you've managed to, there was the secular kind of Muslims, there were the awakened Muslims, but not radical. There's like, all the different kind of levels were sort of present in this book, which had, now that I think about it, quite a hefty cast of characters. Yeah, so I think, I don't know, we haven't gotten any questions come in, but is there anything else that you want to add to kind of close, in closing, to that, that I haven't asked about, that you feel would be kind of interesting for subscribers or listeners here to know?
Well, sorry, there's an echo. I don't know if you can hear it firstly.
I can't, but I'm getting this
Let me see if I
screen phenomenon, which is like a bit like...
Okay, I think now I'm good.
Yeah.
Wait, maybe I'll hang up and get back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I might have to do that.
Yeah, or if there's any, maybe I should ask, well, if he has any last questions for Karan, having, read the book. Is there anything you want to add in?
I think Karan is disappearing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really the kind of, now it's like you think about it in this kind of analysis that happens later, and kind of getting a little bit of a understanding of the kind of what informed it all, in the research around it. And it's really fascinating to think of how many kind of facets of this whole experience of Muslims in India was hit through his work, and with so much more nuance.
Is Karan still with us?
He's coming back. He just said, I think he said he would sign out and come back to.
Well, one thing
interesting
to know from your perspective, what do you this book and creating this dialogue around it? I mean, because you yourself have got such rich experience, both as a journalist and a researcher. I'm not aware of what you worked on during your graduate work, but it'd be interesting to know what drew you towards Karan's book and bringing together today.
Well, yeah, the selection process. Sorry, Karan is back with us, but I just we'll take one question myself, and that's, this book was such to me, I think, again, like as you both mentioned, offered an insight that we don't often get through the news, and there's for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes we get a better sense of this idea of militancy and recruitment, but I think that there's a real testament to the shades of gray that are not often explored and in this novel. And that was one reason that I was really drawn to it. But I should say, I think it has made me think a lot about my own graduate research, which was on a different kind of radicalization, political radicalization, that happened for the kind of bearers of the independence movement, figures like Gandhi and Jinnah and Nehru, and so many others, Subhash Chandra Bose, who went to England to, become barristers, become civil servants, really uphold the tenets of the colonial regime in India. And then over the course of their 3 or 4 years in England, I looked at the institutions of Cambridge and Oxford most specifically, but others as well, Sandhurst, and came away with the opposite experience. Over those 3 years, decided that they didn't want anything to do with the colonial administration, and in fact, became leaders of the revolution. So I looked at their meeting notes, their letters home, their autobiographies later in life, about how those few years prompted such a 180. So I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which this shift happens, and the way in which travel informs that shift, and the way in which, really small personal things inform that experience, and what it means to belong. So there was a woman who, I read her diary entries, and she wrote about being at Cambridge, and she was the daughter of Christians, had a really strong Christian family, I believe, from the south of India, where, of course, Christianity has flourished for centuries. And she was walking out of church one day, and someone stopped her and said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here because to learn about Christianity." And she said, "Well, I am Christian." This woman, this British woman, was taken aback and said, "Oh, but you look so very heathen." And so this kind of idea of belonging and where it fits in, and how belonging can be robbed of us in different ways, I think is also interesting. And the kind of, I'm very interested in how personal experiences shape that. Across the board, we see it a lot with people who become terrorists, but just also a sense of disenfranchisement and kind of marginal belonging, for Muslims in America, for Muslims in Western Europe, all these spaces, where it's not just the kind of like broad political, geopolitical ideas that are mapped onto this, but that someone can, ostensibly carry out an attack in the name of Kashmir, but have, a multitude of their own personal reasons for doing so, I think is something that we don't often get to explore as journalists. And I very much, about telling stories and spending a great deal of time with individuals to tell stories. But, there isn't necessarily a space for that always, in breaking news in the kind of way we, the forms of that news takes. And so that's why I thought this book was especially interesting, given kind of my interest in South Asia generally, my work in Pakistan, that kind of thing, where I thought there's so much more to be added to the conversation, and this book really did that. So yeah, that's I'm grateful to have had it. I'm grateful to have had this conversation to learn a little bit more about.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to thank you for putting this together. It's such an amazing box of stuff to use. And I feel the roadmap in particular was really incredible. Kind of like the cliff notes of the book.
Right, because
so thank you so much.
And a researcher, not a researcher, a writer, reporter, I often, as I'm reading, wonder like how much of this is fiction, how much is fact, how much is informed by fact, but not quite 100% true to the facts. And so the roadmap is a way to kind of connect those dots and to offer a little bit of a more nuanced understanding, because I think it's also a question of who you're writing for. And it sounds, in reading the Association of Small Bombs, I got the sense that you were writing for an audience who, would have a sense of what happened in Gujarat, have a sense of the background, have a sense of, the issue of Kashmir. And I appreciate that kind of writing to people who have this basis of information so that we can get into the nuances. But I just sometimes I felt in reading it that maybe it could also benefit some folks who didn't have that kind of background, that maybe would want to know a little bit more. I think, of course, you give us enough, but there's, just to add a little bit more to have that sense of connectedness to the depth of some of those stories that are referenced, but not fully kind of, and that's not the work of the novel to give the cliff notes. And so that's kind of where I thought I could add a little bit for those who may not be so familiar with things that are.
I thought it was incredible.
Thanks. Yeah. All right. Well, I don't remember what our last question was for you, but is there anything you want to add? And same to you, Bilal. Anything that you?
It's interesting what you spoke about. In your own research, looking essentially at how are individuals, distinct societies, communities, and distinct communities, even within those countries, traveling, understanding ideas, bringing them back, and then how do those ideas come from people's minds to actually policy, collective action, and we see that in many positive ways. But I think Karan's book, and especially one thing I think shouldn't be underplayed, or I hope the reader really dive more deeply into, is the periodization, right? 90s and 2000s. Now, this is a very critical moment for the Kashmir conflict. Since 1989, you have fighting Indian forces in Kashmir. And really, it's the rise of jihadism as a tactical form of warfare in the Afghan war that subsequently leads to an adaptation from the Pakistani military to use some of the tactics that were used in Afghanistan in terms of using both religiously motivated violence and the arming of insurgent groups. And that forms a basis of a new form of non-state action in places like Kashmir, but elsewhere too. So here we see, the US-Soviet vector as a Cold War playing out in the theater of war in Afghanistan, which has, by virtue of its tactical side, the arming of jihadists in Afghanistan using both insurgency methods married with a motivation of sort of Islamic ideals, and that finds its pathway into Kashmir, changing the nature of warfare in that contested region, which has offshoots into the everyday sort of smaller forms of conflict and violence that are referenced by Karan's book. So, the 90s and the 2000s are a very interesting period of ideas, both positive and negative, and the speed at which they travel and can inform, and how important it is for us as sort of citizens either writing about this or talking about this to really filter our frameworks with authenticity. And I think Karan's book really helps that from the world of art. And now we talk about fake news and verifying what's true and what's not, but really this problem has existed for quite a while, right? And so I think that that for me is another takeaway from Karan's book, which is how the speed at which ideas have traveled over the last 25, 30 years and informed low-level conflict in cities, in rural areas, really there's a far bigger story here, and it's important to not just grapple with it, but also authenticate which of those ideas are true or not, and which of those ideas are doing the working here.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and then I think that there's also just to, I find this just the premise of following these characters just like very through the aftermath of an attack to be very profound. And I just wanted to share, I went back into my, way back research from grad school, which I don't even, and which dealt with a very, kind of this moment of turning the tide in some ways. But I find it interesting to think about how lived experiences are shaped by an attack and the kind of residual trauma. And I just wanted to share one really small anecdote, if I may, from one of my cousins in Pakistan grew up, in Peshawar, grew up in this time when there was so many bombings so frequently. And her dad told me this after the Peshawar airport was bombed. This was a few years ago. The windows shook, it felt like an earthquake. And she was sort of hopeful that it was an earthquake because an earthquake was somehow more digestible than a terrorist attack, more just like easier to kind of comprehend that there would be a natural calamity than this kind of man-made one. And her father told me, my uncle, that, that they would go to her room at night and see the lights were on. She had her glasses on and they would like turn off the lights, take off her glasses. And then, did this a few times and like realized it was a phenomenon. And like sometimes, and one time went back again and saw that like she had put her glasses back on, she'd put the light back on, and asked her about it later. And she, of course was like really young and told them like, of course, because if there's a terrorist attack and everything falls to bits, like I need to be able to find my way out. I need the lights. I need my glasses. And so these kind of terrorist attacks, we look at them, we mourn them often. There's like this immediate desire to respond, to feel something. And there's, we have the phenomenon now of like Facebook flags to mourn a particular event. But the way in which these kinds of things live on for people, I think gets lost a little bit. And that's something that I thought was really profoundly and delicately dealt with in this work. And just based on some things that I've experienced myself, I thought it was, just really like a very important story to reinsert into this narrative when we think so much about the impact of terrorism, the kind of continuation of militancy is like the people in the midst, and those who are victims, those who are survivors, and those who are bystanders and just privy to that that tragedy, whether they like it or not. And so I thought that was another reason I just wanted to add that in. I thought this book was really
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It means a lot to me. The last thing I wanted to add was that sorry, I have a lot of echoes today. I'm going to go and say it. Was that we've been speaking about fundamentalism here in India as well, Hindu fundamentalism, and it's hugely on the rise. And I think there's a very troubling 10, 20 years ahead in India. And a lot of the things that are expressed in the book are going to get worse, particularly the way that Modi and his government are allowing all sorts of violence against minorities, Muslims, Dalits, to continue. And it strikes me as sort of as a way to bookend this conversation, since all of us, the three of us, are sort of people of South Asian origin who have lived in various places. I know, Bilal, you said you've lived in India, and you still go back and forth between India and the US. You're Pakistani British. You grew up in the US, right? And you've been to Pakistan and Malawi and all these other places. Is that there is a kind of confusion and a fragmentariness to the experience of many people. For some of us, it's actually moving back and forth between countries. For others, it's moving back and forth between a westernized space and a traditional space, or a sort of mishmash of cultures in cities like Delhi and Hyderabad and Peshawar. But it seems to me that there's two ways that people are responding to it. One is by rushing back into the most backward form of their culture. So in the case of Hinduism, it would be people saying, look, Hinduism was always the greatest religion. We, in 3000 BC, had invented the airplane. And we had all the great technologies, we had plastic surgery, and we're going to beat our chests. And the other way is to somehow learn to live with the confusion and fashion something new out of it. And I think that the hope will be that more of us will be willing to take that alternative, or to seek that alternative, whatever it may be. It's not completely clear what it is, rather than having this very reactionary response. So I think it's sort of it's a really interesting and strange time, and it's therefore a good time to do journalism and to do policy and to write novels, because I feel this confusion inside me on a daily basis. I've come back to Delhi, and the minute I come here, I think to myself, why did I ever leave? Why did I go away and sort of get so confused? Why am I just not leading like sort of a completely traditional life here, which I could have led? And then, of course, I started looking at it more rationally, and all the things I do in some way are related to the experience that I had in the West too. So it's really a long process of coming to terms with yourself, and people are going to have to do it on an individual level and on a social level, I think, for it to work out.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. We have similar currents, and I think it's worth looking at those things. Wherever you are, the rise of kind of very nationalist ideas in the U.S. as well, and in parts of Western Europe and beyond. So I think it's there's connecting the global and then the personal again, and reflecting on both of those is an important work for all of us to do. I just want to thank you so much for joining this conversation, for sharing your insights, and pulling back the curtain, sharing a little bit more about the process of writing, which I think, anyone who writes is like endlessly fascinated by, and anyone who appreciates great literature is very curious about. So I appreciate that. And thank you, Bilal, for your insights about the kind of history and sociology behind some of what Karan wrote about. Thank you for a rich discussion. Appreciate you both.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Bilal. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Karan.